and thank you for being here today. I want to tell you a story about a man who quietly worked behind someone else's spotlight until the truth forced an entire company to finally see him. And maybe, somewhere in this story, you might see a part of yourself. The meeting started like any other. A long table, senior managers on both sides, laptops open, coffee cups half empty. At the front of the room, the CEO stood beside a large screen. He looked excited. "This project," he said, calmly but firmly, "will decide the future of this company." Everyone straightened in their chairs because everyone knew what he meant. For months, the company had been chasing one contract, one massive client, one opportunity that could double the company's revenue. And whoever led that project would likely become the next director. At the far end of the table sat Daniel Carter, quiet, hands folded. No one noticed him. That wasn't unusual. Daniel had worked at the company for 3 years, and during those 3 years he had built a reputation for one thing: getting things done. Not talking, not presenting, not networking, just working. Most nights, the office lights went off around 8, but Daniel often stayed until midnight. Sometimes later, he fixed bugs in other teams' projects. He rewrote proposals that weren't good enough. He caught problems before they became disasters. And for the last 8 months, he had done almost nothing except work on this contract. Research, risk analysis, financial projections, legal review. Every page, every number, every line of the proposal, Daniel knew it better than anyone, which is why he wasn't surprised when the CEO said, "Let's hear from the project lead." Several people turned their heads toward the center of the table, not toward Daniel, toward David. David stood up smoothly, confident, relaxed, the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately belong there. He adjusted his suit jacket and smiled. "Thank you," he said. Daniel watched quietly, because the slides that appeared on the screen were his. Every chart, every graph, every financial projection. David spoke clearly. Charismatic, he explained the strategy, the market opportunity, the growth forecast, the legal safeguards. He even paused at one moment and said, "This deal is structured very carefully. We've minimized every possible risk." Daniel looked down at the table. Right in front of him was a thick document, the contract, printed, bound, waiting for signatures. And Daniel knew something no one else in that room knew. There was a mistake inside that contract, a single clause, buried deep inside the legal language, one line that could expose the company to millions in liability. Daniel had found it 3 weeks ago. He had written a detailed report about it. He had emailed it 3 times, all to one person, David. But David never mentioned it, not once. Now the presentation ended. Silence filled the room for a moment. Then the CEO stood up, smiling. He walked across the room and shook David's hand. "Outstanding work," he said. "You've just delivered the biggest opportunity in this company's history." Applause followed. Light, professional, but full of approval. Daniel did not clap. He simply watched the contract on the table, because in less than 48 hours, someone would sign it. And when they did, the responsibility would belong to the person who led the project, David. The meeting ended. People gathered their laptops. Several managers stopped to congratulate David. One of them said, "Looks like you just secured your promotion." David laughed. "You know, it was a team effort." But he never looked toward Daniel, not even once. Daniel stayed seated after everyone left. The room slowly became quiet again. He picked up the contract, flipped through the pages, and stopped exactly where he already knew the problem was. Clause 14. 2. A liability structure that would shift legal responsibility in a very dangerous way. If the client activated that clause, the company could be forced to absorb massive losses. Daniel had spent days trying to fix it. He had written explanations, sent warnings, but now he closed the contract calmly because something inside him had changed. The next morning, Daniel submitted his resignation. No explanation, just a short email, 2 sentences. Human Resources was confused. His manager tried to call him. Daniel didn't answer. By the end of the week, his desk was empty. 3 weeks passed. At first, everything seemed perfect for the company. The contract was signed. Press releases were published. David was promoted to senior project manager. Internally, people called him the rising star of the company. Until one Monday morning, an urgent message appeared in the executive inbox. The client had discovered a serious issue in the contract structure. Legal teams were involved. Financial risk was escalating. Within hours, executives were arguing in conference rooms. Emails were flying everywhere. Someone pulled the original project documentation, and there, in the internal files, was Daniel's name. Over and over. Risk analysis, financial models, legal summaries. Everything pointed back to him. And then someone noticed something strange. Daniel had resigned. The day before the contract was finalized, the CEO stared at the screen, then said quietly, "Call him." Because suddenly, the company believed Daniel Carter had made a mistake. A very expensive mistake. But when they finally reached him, Daniel listened quietly on the phone, and then he said something that made the entire executive team go silent. He said, "I warned you about that clause." A pause, then another sentence, controlled, almost distant. "But before we talk about fixing the problem," Daniel said, "we should probably talk about how it got there in the first place." And that was the moment the company realized something. Daniel Carter hadn't been surprised by the crisis. Not at all. In fact, he had been expecting their call. Because when they asked him to return and take responsibility for the mistake, they had no idea. He had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. If you had walked through the office 2 months before everything collapsed, you probably wouldn't have noticed. Daniel Carter. Most people didn't. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the type to dominate meetings or interrupt people with bold ideas. Daniel was the kind of employee companies quietly depend on, but rarely celebrate. He arrived early. Usually before the office filled with voices and keyboard noise, he liked those first 30 minutes of silence. Coffee, laptop, a long list of tasks, and the steady rhythm of work. Daniel was 32 years old, a project manager, not a senior title, not a junior one either, just somewhere in the middle, a place where expectations were high, but recognition was often optional. His desk sat near the far side of the open workspace, close to a window that overlooked the parking lot. From there, he could see people arriving every morning, sales teams rushing in, marketing groups laughing loudly, executives walking quickly with phones pressed to their ears. Daniel rarely joined those conversations, not because he disliked people, but because he believed something very simple, something he had believed for most of his career. If you do good work, people will notice. It sounded reasonable, logical, and Daniel had built his entire professional life around that idea. When projects ran into trouble, Daniel fixed them. When teams missed deadlines, Daniel stayed late. When someone needed help with financial models or technical reports, Daniel was the one people asked. Quietly, privately, because Daniel never complained. He just solved problems. Sometimes he stayed in the office until midnight. The cleaning staff knew his name. The security guard would occasionally stop by and say, "Still here." Daniel would smile, just finishing something, and most nights he meant it. But Daniel's story at this company didn't begin with ambition. It began with disappointment. Years earlier, he had worked somewhere else, another company, another team, and there, Daniel had learned a painful lesson. At that job, he had also worked late, also solved problems, also built an important proposal that helped the company win a large client. Except when the promotion came, it didn't go to him. His manager had presented the project as his own work. Daniel had watched the entire thing happen in a conference room, very similar to the one we saw earlier. The applause, the handshake, the congratulations, all directed at someone else. After that day, Daniel left the company, not angrily, just quietly. But before leaving, he made a promise to himself, a simple one. Next time, I'll make sure my work speaks for itself. And when he joined this new company, things seemed different, more professional, more transparent. The culture looked healthier. People collaborated. Managers encouraged open discussion. At least, that was the impression. And during Daniel's first year there, he met someone who quickly became a close colleague. David Brooks. David was everything Daniel was not. Confident, charming, the type of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. He spoke easily with executives. He understood how to tell a story during presentations, and he had a talent for turning complicated ideas into simple conversations. The two of them started working together on projects. At first, it was natural. Daniel handled the deep technical analysis, financial projections, risk assessments, documentation. David handled the meetings, client calls, executive presentations, and together they were effective, very effective. Projects moved faster, deadlines were met. Managers started trusting them with bigger responsibilities. Soon they began eating lunch together several times a week. Sometimes they stayed late, working through strategies for upcoming proposals. David often leaned back in his chair and said things like, "You know what your problem is?" Daniel would look up from his laptop. "What? You're too quiet." David laughed lightly. "You do great work, but if you don't talk about it, nobody will know." Daniel shrugged. "I'm fine with that." David shook his head. "No, you're not." But Daniel believed he was, because for the first time in years, things were going well. And then the opportunity appeared. It arrived in the form of a single email from the executive team. Subject line, strategic client acquisition. Inside, the message was a short explanation. The company had the chance to secure a contract with one of the largest clients in their industry, a long-term partnership, potentially worth tens of millions over several years. Winning that contract would change the company's trajectory. It would also change someone's career, because whoever led the project would almost certainly be promoted. Within hours, the office buzzed with speculation. People whispered about who might lead it. Senior managers discussed possible teams. Daniel read the email twice, then opened a new document. He didn't say anything to anyone. He simply started working. Market analysis, risk projections, financial modeling, regulatory compliance. Daniel approached the project the same way he approached everything else. Quietly, thoroughly. But this project was bigger, more complex. And it quickly became clear that the company would form a small core team to handle it. A few days later, Daniel received another message, a meeting invitation, Project Strategy Group. When he entered the conference room that afternoon, David was already there. David smiled. Well, looks like we're doing this together. Daniel nodded. That was the beginning of 8 months of intense work, research, negotiation strategies, financial structures, dozens of late nights. Sometimes the two of them were the last people left in the building. Daniel built the financial backbone of the proposal. Detailed projections, risk mitigation plans, legal structures designed to protect the company. David turned those numbers into presentations, stories, narratives executives could understand. And slowly, the proposal took shape. By the 6th month, the executives were impressed. By the 7th month, they were confident. By the 8th month, they were ready to move forward. There was only one final step: the presentation to leadership. The moment when someone would formally present the proposal and become the official project lead. Daniel assumed the two of them would present together. That seemed logical. After all, they had built it together. But a week before the meeting, the CEO made an announcement. "We'll keep the presentation simple," he said. "One voice, one lead." Everyone in the room looked toward David, because David had always been the speaker, the one comfortable in front of executives. David glanced briefly toward Daniel, then smiled. "Don't worry," he said quietly later that afternoon. "This is just the presentation part." He leaned casually against Daniel's desk. "You're still the brains behind everything." Daniel believed him, because at that moment, there was no reason not to. That night, Daniel stayed late again, reviewing numbers, double-checking legal clauses. He wanted everything to be perfect, especially the contract. Contracts like this were complicated, hundreds of lines of legal language. Small details could change everything. And as Daniel worked through the document one more time, he found something. A clause buried deep in the liability section. One line, just one. But the wording shifted financial responsibility in a dangerous way. If the client activated it, the company could face enormous losses. Daniel stared at the screen for several minutes, then opened a new report, carefully explaining the issue, carefully suggesting how to fix it. He sent the document to David. Subject line: Urgent Contract Clause Review. David replied later that night. Short message: Got it. I'll look at it. Daniel relaxed. Problem identified. Solution proposed. Everything under control. Or so he thought, because 3 days later, the CEO called the entire leadership team into a conference room and made an announcement that would change everything. "We will present the proposal tomorrow," he said, "and David will lead the presentation." Daniel sat quietly at the end of the table, listening, watching, and somewhere deep inside, a small, uncomfortable question appeared, but he ignored it, because Daniel still believed something he had believed for years. If you work hard enough, eventually the truth shows itself. And tomorrow, he assumed it would. The night before the presentation, the office was almost empty. Most lights had already turned off. Only a few screens still glowed in the darkness. Daniel was still at his desk. He had been reviewing the contract for the 4th time that evening, not because he enjoyed it, but because something about that clause still bothered him. Clause 14. Just one paragraph, but the wording shifted the liability structure in a way that didn't make sense. If the client activated that clause under certain conditions, the company could become financially responsible for costs that normally belonged to the client. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He had already written the report. He had already warned David. Still, something felt unfinished. So he opened a new document and started writing again. A clearer explanation this time, step by step. Why the clause was dangerous, how it could be fixed, what could happen if it wasn't. He attached examples, numbers, Worst-case scenarios. By the time he finished, the office clock showed 2:07 a.m. Daniel read the document one more time, then sent it. Subject line: Final Risk Review, Contract Clause 14. 2. Recipient David Brooks. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. A reply. Short. Simple. Thanks. I'll take care of it. Daniel closed his laptop. Satisfied. Problem solved. He walked out of the office feeling tired but calm. Because this time would be different. This time his work would matter. This time the truth would show itself. The next morning the conference room filled quickly. Executives, senior managers, department heads. Everyone knew how important the meeting was. Daniel chose a seat near the end of the table. Not hiding, just observing. David stood near the screen, preparing the presentation. He looked confident, relaxed. When he noticed Daniel, he gave a quick, friendly nod. Then the CEO entered. The room quieted immediately. "Let's begin," he said. David stepped forward. The first slide appeared. Daniel recognized it instantly. A market growth chart he had built 2 months earlier. Then the second slide. Financial projections, his numbers, his formulas. The third slide. Risk mitigation strategy. Also his work. David spoke smoothly, confident, professional. He explained the strategy, the revenue potential, the safeguards that would protect the company. At one moment he even said, "We've carefully reviewed every legal clause to minimize exposure." Daniel felt something tighten slightly in his chest, because the slide behind David displayed a simplified version of Daniel's own legal analysis. But the warning about Clause 14(7) was missing. Not hidden, just gone. The presentation continued. 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Questions from executives. David answered them easily. By the end, the room felt optimistic, excited. Then the CEO stood up. He walked across the room toward David and extended his hand. "Excellent work," he said. "This is exactly the level of leadership we need." Applause filled the room. Professional, polite, but full of approval. Then the CEO added something that changed everything. "David, starting today, you will officially lead this project." Another wave of applause. Daniel stayed quiet. He looked down at the printed contract in front of him, the same one everyone else would soon celebrate. His name appeared nowhere on the document, nowhere in the slides, nowhere in the conversation. 8 months of work, reduced to silence. The meeting slowly ended. People gathered their laptops. Several executives stopped to congratulate David. Someone joked about his future promotion. David laughed modestly. "You know, the team deserves credit too." But Daniel noticed something strange. David never looked toward him, not once. After everyone left, the room became quiet again. Daniel remained seated. The contract still lay on the table. He picked it up, turned to the liability section. Clause 14. T. Still there, still unchanged, still dangerous. Daniel thought about the email he had sent at 2 a.m. He thought about David's reply. "I'll take care of it." But clearly, David had not. For several minutes, Daniel simply sat there, thinking, not angry, not even surprised, just thinking, because suddenly something became very clear. David hadn't forgotten the clause. He had ignored it. Daniel wasn't sure. Maybe David believed the risk was small. Maybe he assumed the lawyers would catch it later. Or maybe he simply didn't want anything delaying the deal. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The company was about to sign a contract with a serious legal vulnerability, and the person responsible for the project was now David. Daniel slowly closed the contract. That was the moment something inside him shifted, a quiet realization. For years, Daniel had believed that doing good work was enough. But sitting alone in that empty conference room, he finally understood something different. Sometimes truth doesn't protect you. Sometimes silence allows someone else to rewrite the story. Daniel stood up, walked back to his desk, opened his laptop, and reviewed the email thread one more time. There it was. 3 messages, 3 warnings, all sent to David, all ignored. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. Then he whispered something very quietly, not with anger, but with clarity. "If you want the credit," he said softly, "you should also take the responsibility." Daniel closed the laptop, turned off the light above his desk, and walked out of the office, because for the first time, he had decided not to fix the problem. He had decided to let the story continue, exactly the way it was heading. 3 days passed after the presentation. The office atmosphere had changed, not dramatically, but enough that everyone could feel it. People spoke a little louder in the hallways, more smiles, more excitement, because the company believed they were about to secure the biggest contract in its history. And in the middle of all that excitement, David walked through the office like someone who had just stepped into a brighter future. His schedule was suddenly full of meetings. Executives invited him to strategy sessions. Sales teams asked him questions about the upcoming partnership. Someone from HR even stopped by his desk to congratulate him. Daniel watched most of this from across the room, quietly, working exactly the same way he always had. If anyone expected him to react differently, they were disappointed. Daniel did not complain. He did not argue. He did not send angry emails. Instead, he continued doing what he had always done, reviewing documents, answering technical questions, helping other teams solve small problems. But inside his mind, something had changed. Daniel no longer believed recognition would arrive on its own, and he no longer believed everyone around him was playing the same game. Late that afternoon, David appeared beside his desk. "Hey," David said casually. Daniel looked up. David was smiling, relaxed, almost celebratory. "Got some good news," David said. Daniel closed the document on his screen. "What happened?" David leaned against the edge of the desk. "I officially got the promotion." He said it lightly, as if it were just another update. "Senior project manager." Daniel nodded once. "That's great." David laughed. "I told you things would work out." Then he added something else. "Don't worry though. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Daniel didn't respond immediately. David continued speaking. "You did a lot of the groundwork for this project," he said. "And once the deal closes, there will be plenty of opportunities." Daniel studied his face, not searching for guilt, just trying to understand something. "Have you reviewed the final contract yet?" Daniel asked quietly. David waved a hand casually. "Legal handled the final version." Daniel leaned slightly forward. "There was a clause in the liability section I flagged." David smiled again, relaxed, confident. "Daniel," he said, "I know what I'm doing." The conversation ended there. David returned to his desk. Daniel sat still for several seconds. Then he opened his email. And that was when something strange happened. At the top of his inbox was a message from HR. Subject line: "Promotion, recommendation, senior project manager." Daniel opened it slowly. Inside the message was a short note. The executive team had been considering him for the same promotion. Apparently, some leaders believed the project had been a collaborative effort, and they wanted to recognize both contributors. Daniel read the email twice. For the first time that week, he felt something close to relief. Maybe things would balance out after all. Maybe someone had noticed, but that feeling didn't last long, because 2 hours later, another message arrived. Short, direct, from Human Resources. Update regarding promotion review. Daniel opened it. The message explained that the position had already been filled by David. The company had decided to move forward with a single project leader. Daniel stared at the screen. No anger, no shock, just a quiet sense of clarity. The system hadn't failed. It had simply chosen someone else, someone more visible, someone more comfortable in front of executives. Daniel closed the email. He sat there for a long moment. Then he opened a blank message window. The cursor blinked on the screen. Waiting. Daniel began typing. Not quickly, not emotionally, just carefully. Each sentence short, professional, clear. When he finished, the email contained only 2 lines. Subject, resignation. Message, please accept this as my formal resignation. Effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunities during my time here. Daniel read it once, then pressed send. No dramatic moment, no announcement, no argument, just a quiet decision. The next morning his desk looked different. A cardboard box sat beside the chair. Inside were a few personal items. A notebook, a coffee mug, a framed photo from a company event years earlier. Daniel packed them slowly. Some co-workers noticed. A few asked what was happening. Just moving on. Daniel said. They seemed surprised. But the big project, someone said. Daniel only smiled politely. It's in good hands. His manager tried to call him later that morning. Daniel let the phone ring. Then he turned it off. By lunchtime, his desk was empty. The building continued operating exactly as before. Meetings, emails, deadlines. The company had already shifted its focus toward the final stage of the contract. David was busy preparing the signing ceremony. Legal teams finalized documents. Finance teams projected revenue growth. Everything moved forward. 2 weeks later, the announcement came. The contract was officially signed. Press releases were published. Executives celebrated. Inside the company, David's reputation grew even stronger. People called him the architect of the biggest deal the company had ever secured. And Daniel Carter was barely mentioned anymore. But somewhere far away from that office, Daniel watched the news quietly on his laptop. He listened to the CEO describe the partnership. He listened to David talk about the future of the company. Then Daniel closed the video, not with bitterness, not with regret, just with patience. Because Daniel understood something the company did not. They believed the story had already reached its happy ending, but Daniel knew the story hadn't even reached the middle yet. And 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Monday morning, the first email arrived that proved it. An urgent message from the client's legal department. Subject line, contract liability, clarification required. Within minutes, executives began calling emergency meetings. Finance teams started reviewing documents. Legal departments opened the contract again. And buried deep in the liability section, they found it. Clause 14. C. The clause Daniel had warned about. The clause no one had fixed. The clause that could expose the company to millions of dollars in risk. Panic spread quickly. Executives demanded explanations. Managers searched through old project files. And eventually, someone discovered Daniel's name. Again, and again, and again. Risk reports, financial analysis, legal warnings, all connected to him. And then someone noticed the date on his resignation. The day before the contract had been finalized. The CEO leaned back in his chair, thinking. Then he gave a single instruction: find him. Because suddenly, Daniel Carter was no longer invisible. Now he was the only person who might understand what had gone wrong, and the company desperately needed him to come back. But they didn't know something important. Daniel had never left without a reason, and when their call finally reached him, he answered calmly, almost as if he had been expecting it. The phone rang while Daniel was making coffee. A quiet apartment, early morning light. For the first time in years, his mornings were slow. No rushing to meetings, no late-night emails waiting for answers, just silence. The phone vibrated again. Daniel looked at the screen. Unknown number. He already knew who it was. He let it ring once more before answering. Hello? There was a brief pause. Then a familiar voice. Daniel? This is Karen from the executive office. Karen rarely called anyone directly. She worked closely with the CEO. Her voice sounded careful, almost formal. We need to speak with you about the contract project. Daniel took a sip of coffee. I assumed that might happen. Another pause. Karen continued. There's been a complication. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He already knew the complication. Clause 14. T. Karen spoke again. The leadership team believes you were heavily involved in the legal risk analysis for the project. Daniel walked toward the window, looking out across the quiet street. That's correct. We'd like you to come in today, she said. There are some things we need to clarify. Daniel thought for a moment, then asked calmly, Is David there? Karen hesitated. Yes. Daniel nodded slowly. All right. He gave them a time and ended the call. 2 hours later, Daniel stepped into the same office building he had left weeks earlier. Nothing looked different. The same reception desk, the same open workspace, the same conference rooms. But the energy had changed. People looked worried. Whispers moved through the hallways. Executives walked quickly between offices. The moment Daniel appeared near the main conference room, several heads turned. Some people recognized him. Some did not. But the tension in the building was obvious. Karen greeted him outside the meeting room. Thank you for coming, she said. Daniel nodded politely. Inside the room sat 6 people. The CEO, 2 executives from finance, the head of legal, Karen, and David. David looked different than the last time Daniel had seen him. Less relaxed, less confident. But when Daniel entered the room, David still attempted a small smile. Daniel, he said. Daniel nodded once. The CEO gestured toward an empty chair. Please sit. Daniel sat. A thick, printed contract lay in the center of the table. The same document, the same pages, the same clause. The CEO spoke first. We have a problem. Daniel didn't react. The client's legal team flagged an issue with clause 14. C. Daniel remained calm. The head of legal leaned forward. This clause changes the liability structure under certain circumstances. Daniel nodded. Yes. The finance executive added, if triggered, it could expose the company to significant financial responsibility. Daniel nodded again. Yes. The CEO folded his hands, and according to the documentation, he paused. You were responsible for preparing the risk analysis for this project. Daniel looked directly at him. That's correct. The CEO's voice hardened slightly. Then, we need you to explain why this issue wasn't addressed. Silence filled the room. For a moment, Daniel simply studied the contract. Then he looked up. I did address it. Several people shifted in their chairs. The legal director spoke. We've reviewed the final documents. It's not in the final version. Daniel leaned slightly forward. I know. David finally spoke, his voice tight. Daniel, if you saw a problem, you should have escalated it. Daniel turned toward him slowly. I did. David frowned. No one received anything from you. That was the moment Daniel placed his laptop on the table. He opened it. The screen lit the quiet room. Inbox. Search bar. Daniel typed one phrase. Clause 14. See. 3 emails appeared, all sent weeks before the contract signing. All addressed to David. Subject lines clear. Urgent contract clause review. Risk exposure analysis. Final risk review contract clause 14. See. Daniel turned the screen slightly so everyone could see. The room became very quiet. The legal director leaned closer. Open the first one. Daniel clicked. The email expanded. A detailed report. Clear explanation. Attached documents. Evidence. Then the second email. Follow-up warning. More detail. And the third, sent at 2:07 a.m., the night before the presentation. A full risk breakdown. Worst-case financial exposure. The CEO slowly looked toward David. David's face had lost its color. He began, but the words didn't come easily. I must have missed those. Daniel didn't interrupt. He simply watched. The finance executive spoke next. These emails were sent directly to you. David rubbed his forehead. There were a lot of messages that week. Daniel finally spoke. Quietly. I also mentioned it in person. David looked at him, confused. You did. Daniel nodded. The day you told me about your promotion. Silence again. The CEO leaned back in his chair. Processing. For the first time since the meeting began, the narrative had changed. This wasn't about Daniel failing to identify the risk. The evidence showed he had done exactly that. The problem was something else. Something much more uncomfortable. David had known, and the contract had been signed anyway. The CEO spoke slowly. David, why wasn't this addressed before signing? David looked around the table, cornered. It didn't seem like a major issue at the time. The legal director raised an eyebrow. This clause could cost us millions. David's voice tightened. We were under pressure to close the deal. Daniel remained silent. He didn't need to say anything else. The truth was already in the room. But the CEO looked back at Daniel. And yet, he said, you resigned the day before the contract was finalized. Daniel nodded. Yes. Why? Another quiet moment passed. Daniel answered honestly. Because I realized my work was no longer being used. The room absorbed that statement. No accusation, no anger, just fact. Then the CEO asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Daniel, can this contract be fixed? Daniel looked down at the document again. Clause 14. See, the same words he had studied so many times. He closed the contract slowly. There may be a way, he said. Hope appeared across several faces in the room, but Daniel continued. However, he paused. Fixing it will require negotiation with the client. The legal director nodded. That's obvious. Daniel looked at the CEO. They will want concessions. How serious? Daniel answered calmly. Serious enough that the company may have to give something up. Silence returned, because now everyone understood the real situation. The deal wasn't just flawed, it was fragile, and the person who understood it best was sitting quietly at the end of the table. The same person who no longer worked there. The CEO studied Daniel carefully, then asked the most important question of the day. Daniel, are you willing to help us solve this problem? For the first time since the meeting began, Daniel didn't answer immediately, because helping them would mean something. It would mean stepping back into the same system that had ignored him, the same company that had erased his work, the same place where David had taken the credit. And yet, Daniel wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about something else, something simpler. Professional integrity. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Yes," he said, but the next sentence changed the room again. "I'm willing to help." He paused, then added calmly, "But not as an employee." The executives exchanged glances. Daniel continued, "If I work on this problem, I will do so as an independent consultant." Another silence followed, because now the balance of power had shifted. For the first time in the entire story, Daniel Carter wasn't the quiet employee sitting in the corner. Now he was the one holding the solution, and everyone in that room knew it. But what none of them realized yet was that the real turning point of the story had only just begun. For several seconds after Daniel finished speaking, no one in the room said anything. The air felt heavier than before, because Daniel's words had quietly changed the entire situation. Just an hour ago, the company believed Daniel was responsible for a mistake. Now they understood something different. Daniel wasn't the problem. He was the only person who knew how to solve it. The CEO leaned back in his chair and studied him carefully. "You're asking us to hire you as a consultant," he said. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The finance director shifted slightly. "That's an unusual arrangement," she said. Daniel didn't disagree. "It's also an unusual situation." No one argued with that. Across the table, David stared at the contract. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. The confident energy that once surrounded him had disappeared. The CEO finally broke the silence. "What would your role involve?" he asked. Daniel answered calmly. "I would review the contract structure again, identify negotiation points, and propose revisions that reduce liability." The head of legal nodded slowly. "That's exactly what we need." The CEO asked the obvious question next. "And your terms?" Daniel didn't rush the answer. He had already thought about this long before he walked into the building that morning. "Short-term consulting agreement," he said, "project-based compensation, and full authority to communicate directly with the client's legal team." The executives exchanged quick glances. They understood why Daniel wanted that last condition. If he was going to fix the problem, no one else could interfere with the process. Finally, the CEO nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll arrange it." The legal director leaned forward. "We need to move quickly. The client expects a response within 48 hours. Daniel closed the contract and stood up. "Then we should start immediately." The next 2 days moved quickly. Daniel worked from a temporary office inside the legal department, not the open workspace where he used to sit, not the desk near the window overlooking the parking lot. This room was quieter, more focused. Lawyers brought him documents. Financial analysts provided updated projections. Daniel reviewed every section of the contract again, carefully, patiently, just as he had before. But this time something was different. People listened when he spoke. When Daniel pointed out a risk, someone wrote it down. When he suggested a structural revision, lawyers examined it seriously. For the first time since the project began, Daniel wasn't invisible. Late on the second evening, he finally pushed the contract away from his desk. "There's a solution," he said. The legal team gathered around. Daniel pointed to the liability section. "If we restructure Clause 14(7) and adjust the risk allocation across 2 supporting clauses," he explained slowly. "Step by step, the exposure disappears." One of the lawyers frowned slightly. "But the client won't accept that change easily." Daniel nodded. "That's why we offer something else." "What?" "A minor revenue adjustment in year 3. The finance director looked up. "That reduces profit." "Very slightly," Daniel replied, "but it protects the company from catastrophic loss." Silence followed. Then the legal director smiled. "That might actually work." The proposal was sent to the client's legal team the next morning. Then everyone waited. For 12 long hours, executives checked their phones constantly. Lawyers refreshed their inboxes. The CEO walked through the office several times. Finally, an email arrived. The client had reviewed the revised structure. They agreed to the changes. The liability risk was removed. The contract would move forward, stable, and the company would still keep the partnership. Relief spread through the building. People exhaled for the first time in days. Some executives even applauded quietly. The crisis was over. Later that afternoon, the CEO asked Daniel to return to the conference room, the same room where the presentation had taken place weeks earlier. This time the room felt different, less formal, more honest. The CEO stood when Daniel entered. "I want to thank you," he said. Daniel nodded politely. "You're welcome." The CEO continued. "You saved the company from a very serious situation." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said something simple. "I only corrected something that should have been addressed earlier." The CEO understood what he meant. Across the table, David sat quietly. He hadn't spoken during the entire meeting. Finally, the CEO looked toward him. "David," he said, "this project will be reassigned." David lowered his eyes. No argument, no defense. The decision had already been made. Then the CEO looked back at Daniel. "You've demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need here." He paused. "We would like you to return to the company." The offer hung quietly in the air. For a moment no one moved, because everyone in the room knew what the CEO meant. Promotion, authority, recognition, everything Daniel had once worked for. Daniel looked down at the contract on the table, the same contract that had started everything. He placed one hand gently on it, a symbol of months of work, of warnings ignored, of truth eventually revealed. Then he looked up again and smiled politely. "Thank you," he said, "but I won't be returning." The CEO seemed surprised. "You're sure?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." "Why?" Daniel considered the question for a moment, then answered honestly. "Because sometimes the best way forward is somewhere new." Well, no one argued with him. They understood. Daniel had already moved beyond this place. The meeting ended quietly. People shook his hand as he left the room. The legal director thanked him again. Even David stood slowly and approached him near the door. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then David said quietly, "I should have listened to you." Daniel studied his face, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with calm understanding. "Yes," Daniel said, "you probably should have." And with that, he walked out of the building for the last time, not as an employee, not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone who had finally reclaimed his own story. 3 months later, Daniel Carter walked into another conference room. Different company, different city, different future. The building was larger, the projects more ambitious, but Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He had joined the company as a project director, not because of connections, not because of office politics, but because during the interview process, he had told the entire story honestly. The mistakes, the warnings, the contract crisis, and the way it had been solved. The executives had listened carefully. Then one of them said something Daniel would never forget. "We don't just hire people who succeed," the executive said. "We hire people who tell the truth when it matters." On Daniel's first day, the team gathered in a conference room. A whiteboard stood at the front. Written across the top were simple words: Project Director Daniel Carter. Daniel paused for a moment before sitting down. Months earlier, he had sat quietly at the end of another table, invisible. Now, the room looked toward him, waiting, listening. Daniel opened the meeting calmly. "Let's talk about the project," he said, not with excitement, not with ego, just with quiet confidence. Later that afternoon, Daniel placed a document on his desk. A contract, a new one. He flipped through the pages carefully, checking every clause, every condition. When he reached the liability section, he smiled slightly. Then he closed the document, because this time, the story was different. Not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because Daniel had finally learned something important. Recognition doesn't come from being the loudest voice in the room. It comes from standing by the truth, even when no one is listening. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't proving someone else wrong. Sometimes it's simply walking forward into a better chapter of your own life. Final reflection. In the end, the contract that once represented betrayal became something else entirely. At first, it was a symbol of silence. Then, it became a symbol of truth. And finally, it became a reminder that integrity may move slowly, but when it arrives, it changes everything. Before we end today's story, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for staying here until the very end, for listening, for sharing these quiet minutes with a story that, in many ways, might feel a little familiar. Because stories like Daniel's are not rare. In offices, in classrooms, in families, in everyday life, there are always people who speak loudly, and there are people who simply keep working. Daniel was never the loudest person in the room. He didn't chase attention. He didn't push his way to the front of every conversation. He just did the work, day after day. Late nights, early mornings, quiet effort that very few people noticed. And for a long time, it probably felt like that effort disappeared into the background. But the truth about effort is something most of us only understand later. Real work leaves traces, not always in applause, not always in promotions, not always in the moment we expect, but somewhere it leaves a mark. Sometimes that mark is a report someone ignored. Sometimes it's a warning someone didn't take seriously. Sometimes it's a quiet decision to walk away instead of fighting to be seen. And sometimes, those quiet choices become the very things that change everything later. Daniel didn't scream when his work was taken. He didn't start arguments. He didn't try to destroy anyone. Instead, he stepped away, and, in doing so, he allowed the truth to arrive on its own time. That part of the story is important, because many of us are taught that if someone treats us unfairly, we must fight loudly, defend ourselves immediately, prove our value in the moment. But life doesn't always move that quickly. Sometimes integrity works slowly. It moves quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, until one day the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment comes, the person who stayed honest with their work is already standing on solid ground. What I find most meaningful about Daniel's story is not the moment when the company realized their mistake. It's what he chose to do afterward. He helped, not because he needed their approval, not because he wanted revenge, but because the work itself still mattered to him. That kind of professionalism, that kind of quiet dignity is rare, and maybe that's why stories like this resonate with so many of us. Because deep down, most people want to believe that doing the right thing still means something, that patience still has value, that integrity still matters, even in a world that sometimes rewards the loudest voices first. Daniel's victory was never really about the promotion. It wasn't about proving David wrong. It wasn't even about saving the company. His real victory came much earlier. It happened the moment he realized something simple but powerful, that he didn't need someone else's recognition to know the value of his work. That realization changed everything, because once you understand that, you stop chasing approval. You start choosing environments where your work is respected. You stop trying to be visible to people who refuse to see you, and instead, you move forward, quietly, confidently, toward places where your integrity becomes your reputation. By the end of the story, Daniel didn't return to reclaim his old position. He didn't need to. He had already grown beyond it. Sometimes life doesn't correct the past by giving us back what we lost. Sometimes it gives us something better, a new room, a new team, a new beginning. And maybe that is the gentlest lesson hidden inside this story. If your work feels invisible right now, if your effort seems unnoticed, if someone else is standing in the spotlight you helped build, that moment does not define the rest of your life. Your story is still moving, and the chapter you are in right now is not necessarily the one that decides where you end up. The world often notices results, but character is what carries you from one chapter to the next. Daniel didn't become successful because the world suddenly became fair. He became successful because he refused to abandon the one thing that mattered most, his integrity, and sometimes that quiet consistency becomes the strongest foundation for a future you never expected. So if there is one gentle thought I'd like to leave you with tonight, it is this: not every truth is heard immediately. Not every good effort is recognized right away. But when you keep showing up with honesty in what you do, life has a quiet way of opening the right doors when the time is right. Maybe not the doors you first knocked on, but the ones that were meant for you. Thank you again for spending this time here. And wherever you are in your own story tonight, I hope you keep going. Because sometimes the most important chapters of our lives begin right after we decide to walk away from the ones that no longer deserve us.